Doctors who have been in an "is anybody here a doctor" situation. What happened? I'm currently a first-year resident, internal medicine in Sweden. This happened last year, about a year after I graduated, so I was still relatively fresh out of med school. I was flying home from my vacation from the Mediterranean, a 3-hour flight, when they announced on the speaker system that they were looking for a healthcare professional. Stood up when they called out a second time, maybe 15 seconds later. It was me and a bit older nurse who went up to the front rows where a middle-aged male was awake, but unresponsive. As I didn't really have a lot of experience and was somewhat panicking, kept the panic internally to myself. It's scary being alone. I fell back to ATLS and eventually noticed that I had a deep problem, decreased strength in one of his arms and one-sided facial droop that was quite mild. Long story short, I suspected a stroke, but couldn't really do a whole lot. We were 30 minutes away from landing at the time of the initial call. They didn't deviate or anything. I didn't feel like I did that much, to be honest, except say that I suspected a stroke and asked if they could call an ambulance to the airport. The airplane seemed to land a bit faster than it usually does, and as we went off the runway, there was an ambulance waiting off the taxiway. When the ambulance staff boarded the plane, I gave a short report, and that's basically it. I got a thank you from the relatives and the stewardesses. They asked me to write down my name and email, but I haven't heard anything since. I used to work as a flight attendant, and thank you for making yourself known. It's always a support, no matter how little you feel you've done. We just get the basic training, depending on the airline a little more or less. So it was always a godsend to me. Even when nothing happened, I always appreciated when doctors made themselves known during boarding. Our airline even has a doctor on board program where you enroll, show up on the passenger list and earn some miles. An eternal gratitude from the flight attendants. As for stroke, my basic training taught me that there's not really much you can do on board except for a diversion. Immediate landing. Since you were that close to the next airport, there was indeed not much you could do, but I'm sure the crew appreciated you being there. Thank you again for what you do. Out of curiosity, what do doctors actually do about a stroke? I always see adverts saying the faster you are, the more of the person you save. But how do they do that? Great question. Basically, to know if you should do something, you have to verify a stroke by doing a CT scan of the head. If it's a hemorrhagic stroke, you can either try to revert the medications that may be causing the bleeding. In some cases you may need to talk to a neurosurgeon if the bleeding may be evacuated, but these types of strokes are a bit rare, covering roughly 15% of all strokes. In terms of ischemic strokes, also known as a clot that stops blood flow to a part of the brain, the most important thing you can do is to try and destroy the blood clot causing the symptoms. Within 4.5 hours, we can thrombolyze, that is, give a medicine that destroys the clot. You can also endovascularly go in through an artery into the brain and pull out the clot, but I personally don't have a whole lot of experience with these patients. This is why time equals brain. The faster you come to the hospital and seek medical attention, the faster we can diagnose and treat, and more percent of the affected part of the brain may survive. Note, I'm not a neurologist. Recently, before the coronavirus, I was taking an international flight. The flight attendant asked on if there was a doctor aboard. I was actually asleep, but somehow that woke me up. And I was like, wait, you need a doctor? Turns out a patient was experiencing some diffuse chest pain. Went to examine him and my inner alarm bells rang when I asked him some questions. I had a very high suspicion that this guy was having an aortic dissection. I told the flight attendant, who passed on the information to the pilot. The pilot made an emergency landing at a different airport, met with an ambulance. I later called the hospital to find out what exactly it was, and turns out I was right. If they had carried on, he might not have survived. Oh my goodness, great job. You should feel 10 out of 10 proud of yourself every day for the rest of your life. My mom has had to respond twice on flights when someone was in distress. The first time was in the air and a guy was having a diabetic low. She monitored him until we landed. The second time was sitting on the tarmac when a guy had a stroke. They delayed the flight and took the dude off the plane. She also said that after the first one, the airline sent her a thank you card and said please use these enclosed vouchers to get tickets to a destination of your choosing. But they forgot to include the vouchers. She said she thought it would be rude to write back and say hey, you forgot the vouchers. That's how they jet you. Also, good job on your mom in both cases. Sounds like someone took the free flights for themselves before sending the card out. While we were on our descent, somebody lurched over in their chair and became unresponsive, tachycardic, and diaphoretic. The whole episode lasted for about 2 minutes. Then he woke up and vomited. I figured he had an arrhythmia and recommended he not take his connecting flight to Cleveland and instead go to the ER. Ems was waiting on the ground and helped him off the plane. I actually saw him again on my return flight home. He told me he was diagnosed with an arrhythmia and made an appointment to see a cardiologist in our hometown. It is a somewhat frequent time for arrhythmias to present. I don't fly very often, but I've seen 3, maybe 4 of this type of thing on a flight. Please note, I'm not a doctor, but I'm going on the symptoms you mentioned. I was flying out of my home airport during my intern year. I had just finished my cardiology rotation intensive care. The flight attendant asked for a doctor because a passenger had severe chest pain. It turned out there was also my senior resident and my CCU attending on the same flight. Unknown to me, all 3 of us had worked together for the past 2 months and signed off the CCU the day before. Like a well-oiled machine, we took care of the patient. He was stable thankfully. An ambulance was waiting for him when we landed, and I was very grateful to have both my senior resident and my attending at the time. What a coincidence. Also, because the most exposure I've had to those terms, resident and attending, is via Scrubs, I'm imagining the scene as Dr. Cox, JD, and probably Elliot working together on the patient. Cox probably yelling at Janet to pay some freaking attention or whatnot. My wife is a doctor. She passed out on a plane trip and we had to see if there were any other doctors. My friend has had it happen twice to him, both heart-related in restaurants. Was able to use a defibrillator to save one's life and the other unfortunately passed. Defibrillators don't work if the heart is completely stopped, and CPR is a long shot and didn't work in this case. Many people do not realize that defibs correct the heart rhythm and will not work on anyone whose heart has stopped. I always thought it would shock the heart to start again if it has stopped beating. Yeah, you can thank TV for that. Asystole, the flat line, is not a shockable rhythm, and an automated defibrillator won't let you shock someone in asystole. Ventricular fibrillation and pulseless ventricular tachycardia are the shockable rhythms. Happened in an airplane. Me, as a 4th grade medical student, and my professor at an airplane 4 going to a medical congress in our country. A man 50-ish years old lost his consciousness. We got there before the cabin crew. Yelled the situation. Had to do CPR for 25 minutes until we have landed at an airport for emergency landing. We still had a 1.5 hour away. And we also landed off with him to make him reach hospital Safely. It was a rural military airport. Airplane waited us to return. Took a 40 minutes later after we landed. Got to our destination. In return flight, we were upgraded to business class and taken from our hotel by a private chauffeur. 25 minutes of CPR. You must have been exhausted afterwards. Even 5 straight minutes on a dummy, and I was telling the dummy he wasn't going to make it. You are awesome, and your English is great. We were 2 people and turned in every 2 minutes. I would be giving breaths and my professor would be on compression or vice versa in minute 15. We got a shockable rhythm, so we gave some shock also. At ambulance, he had a regular heartbeat. It was nuts. Staying alive, staying alive. My father, doctor, 30 years ago was sent to work in southern Italy. Although he already lived with my mother in the north, and a large part of the salary ended up in tickets to return by plane every weekend. The fact is that during the flight to the south, lasting about 1 hour, they do not give anything to eat except they pass with a trolley to give candies. Needless to say, the classic situation of the old woman who chokes on it and cannot breathe. My dad was called in with a few heavy blows on the back. He managed to get the candy out of the pool. Old woman. A week goes by and the day of the return on the plane comes. The trolley with the candies passes promptly, and out of nowhere a girl sitting in front of my father who was trying to get one is blocked by her friend. Don't take it. Last week they told me that an old woman got choked up and to free her a doctor had to slap her really hard on the back. I like the thought of an Italian flight where everyone panics, but they find a doctor, and he assesses the situation very carefully and he chooses not to use the Heimlich maneuver, but, instead of that, professionally elects to slap her on the back, but like really hard. I'm a nurse. We're taught to do 5 hard back slaps before moving on to abdominal thrusts. Open-handed, skin on skin, with a wet palm. I choose death. Not in the medical profession, but from my time in the military I knew basic life-saving techniques like CPR and what to do when someone is drowning. My story involved my son when he was 6 years old. We were in town for my father's funeral. That night at the hotel the kids were in the pool. It was packed. He was swimming in the shallow end. Next thing I know, a girl is holding him saying, "I think he's drowning." I pulled him from the pool, asked if he could breathe. He shook his head no. I laid him down, rolled him to his side and hit his back. He started throwing up lungfuls of water. Finally he says he can breathe. My wife is freaking out and he is white as a ghost. He threw up probably 4 or 5 times. Worst part is when I pulled him from the pool, my first thought is I'm gonna watch him die. My wife said I reacted so fast that I had out of the pool before she realized what was happening. I almost lost my composure when he looked at me and said, "Thanks for saving me, Dad." I recommend, if you can, to take some basic life savings classes. Super lucky that the girl noticed. Used to be a lifeguard and it's super difficult to spot people drowning when the pool is busy and loud. Drowning people don't make much of a racket. They just slip away. I warn parents to keep an eye on their own kids in the pool even if you think they can swim and there is a lifeguard on duty. Happy fun can turn to sorrow pretty damn quickly and kids often overestimate their ability. I ended up giving that girl a bouquet of flowers the next morning that were left over from my father's funeral. She was very touched and I made sure to know that she was very instrumental in saving his life. I'm not a doctor, but I'm a nurse. Just yesterday morning, I heard these women screaming in the hallway of my hotel. "We need help. Does anyone know CPR?" I ran out the door and told these women I was a nurse. They took me to the front lobby where they found a young woman who seemed to have overdosed. She wasn't breathing, but she had a pulse at first. It started to get weaker then stopped altogether. I had to do 4 rounds of CPR before I felt a pulse again, and it was right as the EMTs were walking in. I work in nursing homes and most people are DNRs. I've never had to do CPR on anybody. It's crazy that was my first time, and it was at a freaking hotel and not even work. Then you just so happened to ask this question. LOL. You're amazing. She was so lucky you were there. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please smash the like button and leave a comment which story you liked the most. Subscribe and hit the bell notification for updates on our latest videos. And don't forget to check the links in the description box for more awesome content.